I'm reading this book and I'm feeling very elevated, and all of a sudden, what word jumps on the page if not money? What's money doing in a book like this? Hey there, thank you for joining us. I'm Liel Leibovitz, editor-at-large for Tablet Magazine, and I have the distinct pleasure today of talking to the two authors of one of my favorite books in recent months. This one is called People of the Word, 50 Words That Shaped Jewish Thinking. It is so profound and so moving, and we'll get to it in a second. But before we do, I want to say hello to the two distinguished authors. Here in the studio with me in sunny Brooklyn, Zalman Abraham, hello.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting us.
And across the pond in tawny London is Mendel Kalmenson. Hi.
Hi.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. There's a lot to talk about this moving and inspiring book. But I want to start, because we're Jews, I want to start with a difficult, contrarian question, of course, because we're here to have an argument. Now, look, this book is about words, and I have the misfortune of having gone to school to study linguistics, where I was taught that in modern-day linguistics, there's no real connection between things as they exist and the name that we call them. That famous linguist William Shakespeare famously captured the sentiment when he said, "A rose by any other name would still smell so sweet." And yet here you are in the book making a distinctly different argument, saying that indeed the words that we call things have these kinds of secret, almost mystical meanings that could help us unlock reality. Explain this idea to me of the power of words.
Words. Well, let me start with abracadabra. Abracadabra, it's the famous magic word that we all remember as kids from magic shows. What it actually means, it's an Aramaic word that means abracadabra, I will create as I speak. In other words, it's speech, words as a form of creation. God said, let there be light, and there was light. The whole universe was created that way. From the most ancient Kabbalistic text, Sefer Yetzirah, it describes all of reality as we know it, as a compilation, a construct of letters and words. We kind of think of words as being, first you have a thing and then you have a name to call the thing. But what came first, the thing or the name of the thing? Let there be light and there was light indicates that first came the word and then came the thing itself. That the very substance of the universe is created from words. The Baal Shem Tov explains that the verse in Psalms, L'olam dvarcha nitzav b'shamayim, that God's word is forever standing in the heavens, that all of creation is perpetual talk, God speak, right? So when we look around us, we can either see stuff that's there and then talk about that stuff that's there, or we can see communication in it, that the reality is just a means of God communicating to us.
That probably explains why we Jews love to talk so much.
Yes, very much so. So that's really what we try to do in the book, where we try to unpack what is being communicated in many of these words, in 50 of these words. And you asked about Shakespeare. Well, Rabbi Shmuel Bornstein, he wrote the book Shem Mishmuel some 100 years ago. He writes over there that the word for rose in Hebrew, Shoshana, comes from the word Sheshoneh, that changes, indicating its kind of suppleness, its responsiveness to touch. Basically, that a rose by any other name would not smell as sweet, and in fact, it wouldn't be a rose at all. Right?
Fascinating. Rabbi Kalmenson, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that the prime example of this phenomenon is the word for word itself, or the word for speech itself, which is dibur. And as we write an entire chapter in the book, and perhaps we'll get to this a little later, the very word for speech communicates how speech functions and the function of speech. And it also is deeply etymologically linked to the word for thing, which is davar. Again, teaching us that words actually manifest into things. And that's a deeply mystical idea. But there's another layer to this, which is etymologically speaking, these words are essentially descriptive of the thing rather than arbitrary labels that are tacked onto things. So I recently learned something fascinating. The family that discovered nylon named it nylon because they had two offices, one in New York and one in London. In other words, the word nylon has nothing to do with what it actually labels or names. There's something completely arbitrary that was stuck to it like a label as a sort of an inside family nod or wink to their circumstances, but otherwise completely disconnected from nylon as a material itself. So Hebrew, Lashon Kodesh, or the holy tongue, or the divinely designed and crafted tongue, is completely opposite, as Rabbi Zalman indicated earlier. One quick little example before we move on is the word for face. We're doing this across the pond. There's something very interesting that in the English language, for example, face implies something superficial or external, like facade, even something that to a certain extent does not portray or convey what lies behind or within that particular facade. Whereas in Hebrew, the word for face is panim, which literally means panimiyut. That is to say, that which it reflects that which comes from within or the inward. And this is really powerful because the sages teach that chachmat adam ta'ir panav, which means one's personality, one's character is reflected in their face. Their face is a portal or a window rather than a barrier into one's essence. And I think that we as a generation understand this better than any, coming from COVID, where most of our interactions were done via Zoom rather than in person, lacking that certain luminescence, that certain nonverbal communication, the story one's face tells, that is so profound and powerful. Just another example. So it's not just the mystical, which is so powerful, and the root of this idea, teaching that God's language brought the world into being, but also on a linguistic level, Hebrew versus other languages in the main is a storytelling language. The word describes the reality rather than simply being an arbitrary word or label.
You're saying something really interesting here because it almost seems to me like a contradiction. I mean, you would think that if words are so all-powerful that they could literally manifest things into existence, then Judaism would be extremely, extremely adamant about very, very specific words. And yet there is a concept in Hebrew, and you speak about this in the book a little bit, called kelashon bnei adam, in the manner in which people speak, meaning colloquially. And there's, entire tractates of the Talmud in which we say, okay, look, there are certain vows that have to be said a certain way, but if you say them slightly differently, you're still meaning the same thing. In other words, you, as you write in People of the Word, we are still very, very, very mindful that colloquial speech, that figurative speech, not only should it not be frowned upon, but actually is in of itself, even though we think about it as sort of imprecise and flowy, in of itself is another way of manifestation, right? That's kind of weird.
I think there's a difference here between biblical language and, if you will, human vernacular. And I want to just separate them for a moment. The import we're placing on the design, the construct, the properties of language with such a degree of precision and the understanding, the mystical understanding that they manifest reality is rooted in biblical language, Lashon Kodesh, as described earlier. What you're talking about is the vernacular. And when it comes to the vernacular, Judaism takes and specifically Jewish law, takes a very pragmatic approach, which is intent. In other words, the way to understand what people mean is by analyzing how they speak. And that almost takes on, that's a different category from, if you will, a legalistic point of view to understand intention and therefore deal with what one meant, like vows, etc. But the truth is that even in human speech, the mystics tell us that the words we use have tremendous power. And by the way, that's why Judaism is a very speech-oriented religion. People don't realize this, but there is no true freedom of speech in Judaism. There are entire areas of speech that are biblically restricted, limited, inhibited, even forbidden. For example, Lashon Hara, negative talk about another human being, where from a secular point of view, there's no legality to it. right? But in Jewish law, there is an illegality or prohibition when it comes to saying negative talk about others, even when that speech is true. And that's, again, taking into account and being sensitive to the mystical power of language, of words, to manifest the negative within another merely by virtue of speaking it out into the universe. So there's a textured and scaffolded approach of Judaism to language. And there is the biblical, there is the rabbinic, there is the Talmudic, and then there is the vernacular of each time, down to even Ladino and Yiddish, and the elevation of those languages in Jewish culture and consciousness to a different stage and different level of speech. So that's a little nutshell on, various different elements within the power of speech itself.
If I may add, the expression you used, Kilashon B'nei Adam, which means the vernacular, the way people speak, colloquial speech. In English, we just say a figure of speech. Like speech itself is figurative. We don't have to add this aspect of human speech, of social speech.
Right.
In other words, from a Jewish perspective, you have two types of speech. You have speech that is substantial, and then you have the way we talk, which is figurative. And the Talmud, for example, in the Darim, like you mentioned, it's all about translating that vernacular into substance, because ultimately our words are meaningful. They do create realities. What type of realities do those words spoken in the vernacular create?
So I want to focus on that for a minute, because a while back I heard a story that moved me to tears about the Lubavitcher Rebbe saying that we should not call those young men and women who were wounded in their service in the Israeli army Nechei Tzahal, or the IDF, disabled, but rather Mitsuyanei Tzahal, the IDF, the best of the IDF, the most excellent in the IDF. Basically, not to think of these people as people without a specific ability, but of people of great moral and physical courage and excellence despite their physical disability. I want you to explain this to me. I was very moved and touched by this idea, but I want you to delve down a bit deeper on this perception that these words could actually, physically, literally, make a positive impact in the world. That if we just choose one term over the other, we change reality itself, literally speaking.
There's a famous story from the Baal Shem Tov where he overheard two of his students quarreling with each other. One said, "I want to tear you apart like a fish." And he gathered his students together. He said, "Come, let me show you what's going on in the higher realms as you speak those words." And they formed a circle, and they were all able to see the friend actually ripping the other apart like a fish, a very horrific scene. And the point that the Baal Shem Tov was trying to make was that our words do have that type of concrete manifestation in some realm. There's another story that's told of a sage who was a brilliant sage, brilliant mind, who was perplexed with a certain question in the Talmud. And he spent weeks trying to figure out the answer to it. And once he finally figures out the answer, he walks out of the study hall and he sees this newbie who just walked into the study hall for the first time. He opens up the same passage of Talmud, reads over it, and presents the question and the answer without skipping a heartbeat. And he was all downtrodden, like he's questioning himself, his own abilities. Was he stuck on something that's so simple? So he went to his spiritual master and asked him about this, and he said, "No, that's not what happened. What happened was you brought a new idea into the world. It took weeks for you to birth that idea. But once you had birthed that idea, it was available. It was there for the plucking." It's a fascinating idea. We do mention in the book, this is possibly why Newton and Leibniz both discovered calculus at the same time. I'm not sure who came first, but the idea is once the concept is manifest in the world, it's there, right? It's there for someone else to find and discover as well. So it has a real practical physical manifestation. There's a poem I love from Emily Dixon. She says that a word is dead when it is said, some say. I say it just begins to live that day.
That is so beautiful. And what an apt introduction into the heart of our conversation, which is to talk about this gorgeous book. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on specific words, because this is, after all, a celebration of 50 words. But before we do, I have to ask you, 50 words, that sounds like very few. How did you choose? What were the criteria? Were there any left on the cutting room floor, so to speak? Tell me about the process that led you to create this book. Rabbi Kalmenson, maybe we'll begin with you.
Sure. I just want to actually follow up on what Reb Zalman said earlier, because I think it's really interesting, especially Liel, as you introduced this question, with the Rebbe's particular focus and attention to language, and specifically positive language. This particular theme is something that's very close to my heart. In fact, in a previous book I wrote called Positivity Bias, there's an entire chapter called Lashon Tov, which means positive language. And as you touched on, the Rebbe was very, very particular with the words he used to describe things. So a classic example is that instead of using the word deadline, the Rebbe encouraged the use of the word due date. Again, it seems something semantical and perhaps cute, but what the Rebbe was communicating was something very profound. Those words mean something entirely different. Deadline implies that whatever process you began is now coming to its end or demise, whereas due date is implying that it's merely just beginning to gain momentum and new life. The Rebbe, I found something really interesting, was not a big fan of the term Holocaust. This might surprise some of the viewers. And the reason for that is because historically the word Holocaust was used to describe a burnt offering in a, if you will, religious context. And the Rebbe was therefore perhaps quite sensitive to its use, because it might, God forbid, imply that somehow, from a divine point of view, the Holocaust was necessary or received as a part of an offering or a sacrifice, and therefore on some level spiritually justified. And that was something completely antithetical to the Rebbe's views when it came to those who the Rebbe saw as being terribly mistaken by justifying in any way, shape, or form those atrocities, etc., etc. There are so many examples. Even undertake. The Rebbe was really discouraged the term undertaker because of its connection to death, but also because it implies taking on something only half-heartedly. But I want to clarify that all of that sensitivity to language, including not the disabled of Tzahal, but rather the Mitsuyanei Tzahal, that's what I would call psychological, in the sense of there is a perception that is generated by the words we use that has tremendous impact in communication at deepest levels. And in that respect, what the Rebbe was trying to teach through his particularity with language was the power of words to shape perception, psychologically, socially. And that is in itself an incredibly powerful idea.
Absolutely.
But then there's another complete dimension to this, which is the mystical power of language to shape reality itself. Not just the power of words on us and our psyche, but the power of words on existence and reality itself. The manifestation of a new order, of a higher spiritual energy. That's a radically different point, and another very essential one to highlight. Just to conclude this particular point, the Rebbe taught time and again, what's the reason that speaking negative about another person is problematic? There is a saying the Talmud teaches that 3 are affected by negative speech: the speaker, the listener, and the one about whom they spoke. And he asked very often, the speaker, we understand why they're adversely affected, because they did something wrong, morally repugnant. The listener, well, if there were no listeners, then the speakers of negative speech would probably diminish and eventually, over time, dissipate. But what about the person about whom they spoke? Why should they be adversely affected just because 2 individuals decided to engage in an act of gossip? And the Rebbe explained that mystically speaking, because the first spoke about this third individual to the second, on some level, they, through their speech, manifested or brought to the fore within the third individual that negative characteristic, and now it's more manifest in that individual. And that's what we mean by the person's adversely affected. They now need to pretend with that new, as it were, resurgence or excavation of said particular flaw or characteristic. Now, here's the critical point, and with this I'll conclude. The Rebbe said, if that's the case in the negative, how much more so in the positive? Meaning to say, when we speak positively about one another, even in their absence, what we're doing is we're activating that goodness within them that's latent, that's innate. And that's super powerful. And so, whereas there are some communities that the way they address Lashon Hara, negative speech, is by creating an hour of a week or a month. And they say, let us abstain from speaking negative speech during this hour, etc., which is a noble effort in itself. The Rebbe's approach to Lashon Hara was not just the absence of Lashon Hara, but was the introduction of Lashon Tov, of positive language. And that's something that's so deeply connected to what we're speaking about today.
That's beautiful, Rabbi Kalmenson, but that makes me think that it was that much more difficult for the two of you to choose these words. So tell me, how did you do it?
Criteria. So it was difficult. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of words that have fascinating etymological meaning. But we had to create criteria. The criteria was pretty firm. And, as much as you want to include a topic that you feel passionate about, we were strict about those criteria. What were they? Number one, the etymological entry point. Number two, it had to be a big idea. It had to be something that was a philosophical idea, not just a by the way type of point.
And I will entice readers by saying that each entry concludes with a big idea bullet point that in of themselves are deeply moving and useful.
There had to be an aspect of novelty, because if it didn't change the way we think about something, even if it contained within it a big idea, but it wasn't novel in some way, either in contrast to other religions, other cultures, or in contrast to common culture. So there had to be that aspect of novelty, which also adds fascination. And then there had to be the relevance. It had to be something that's meaningful to people, not just an abstract, big philosophical idea that is novel, but also something that has personal meaning in people's lives.
And so let us jump right in, because you mentioned novelty, and one of the very first words in the book struck me right away. And that word was Mitzrayim. Now, I'm a 9th generation Israeli. I'm a native Hebrew speaker. If you say this word to me, I will say immediately to you, it means Egypt. And you said, no, the correct translation would be inhibition. Enlighten me, Rabbi Kalmenson.
Okay, so there seems to be an obsession with Egypt in the Jewish tradition, specifically the Bible. We keep coming back to Egypt again and again. There's even a saying that every single day one should see themselves as having left Egypt. If we were sitting in front of a psychoanalyst, they probably would have advised the Jewish people to move on, as it were, to leave Egypt behind once and for all. And yet, Jewish culture and tradition reminds us, not just once a year, but every day, to leave Egypt behind. So the way to unpack that or to understand that is to draw on the mystical teachings of Judaism, the esoteric wisdom of Kabbalah and Chassidut, which teaches that the Hebrew letters for Mitzrayim, Egypt, when you rearrange the vowels, spells the word Meitzarim, which means limitation, restriction, or inhibition. And hence, they introduce a whole new layer and component to Torah, which is another way of unpacking its meaning, seeing it as a spiritual, psychological template which has perpetual meaning and instruction for each one of us as individuals. And hence, in this way, the Torah can be read as something that happened to a particular group of people at a particular place in a particular time, or as an ongoing narrative within which we can find ourselves and hence, for example, leaving Egypt takes on tremendous meaning in this light because it means the personal limitations we often create, those self-limitations, the self-image. So many of the ways in which we live are based on the way we see ourselves from an internal point of view. And Egypt then takes on tremendous different meaning because it becomes something that we truly need to perpetually emerge from or leave behind on a daily basis, such that yesterday's Egypt might be different from today's, but the need to leave those limitations behind are eternal and perpetual.
Amen Salah. Now, you want to add something, Rabbi Abba?
Yes, I would just add that it also encapsulates Jewish approach to life in general. And I think it sets the tone for the book, because most of the words, what we're trying to do with those words is to show people how the way we commonly think about something needs to be challenged. We need to ask ourselves, what does it really mean? There's more to discover. because there's always more to discover. We're always growing. Every day we're learning new things. We're growing beyond the inhibitions of yesterday. And that is life in a nutshell. And that's really what this book is in a nutshell, to show how each of these words is a constant journey of learning more, of discovering more, of extending beyond ourselves, escaping our own Egypt. And that's really what this whole book is about.
On the theme of growing, look, the book has a very sophisticated structure. We could spend hours talking about how, these words and the way you put them together really kind of give you a blueprint for personal spiritual growth. But here's a little taste. Right after you tell us about inhibition, Mitzrayim, you have an entire section dedicated to how we practically go about the spiritual growth here on earth. And you include words like Rav, or teacher. But you begin this down-to-earth section with the word Na'al, or youth. And you share this insight that I found absolutely astonishing, and I'm not sure I understand it fully, and I wish for you to explain it to me. You write, physically speaking, children are adults in training. But spiritually speaking, adults are children in training. I'm blown away by this. Rabbi, explain this to me.
Yes. So first of all, it's a contrarian theme, which is a lot of what the book's about. And kids are contrarians by nature. Why? Because they're trying to push the limits. They're trying to figure out the world. And I think there are two aspects to that, to being youthful. One aspect is a certain naivete. They don't have those fixed constructs in their mind like adults have. And the second aspect is they have energy. They're driven. Whereas once you get older, you become more complacent naturally. And those are two very powerful themes that adults ought to learn from kids, right? To reclaim that sense of wonder. One of my most fascinating words in the book is the word on time, Zman, where the word rega, which means a moment, according to Rashi, is interpreted as an accordion fold, where time can be contracted or expanded depending on how it's used. And what I love about that is there's a fascinating neurological observation that as we grow older, time gets shorter, our perception of time gets shorter. The same minute we experience more quickly.
All right.
And the reason for that is because kids are learning so much in every minute. Because that minute is filled with wonder, it's filled with all sorts of new experiences that they've never had before. Whereas the adult, it's like same old, same old. So if somehow we could reclaim that newness in the way we saw the world, it explains the Talmudic passage, Kol ha'ma'arich be'echad ma'arichin lo yamav u'shnotav, that whoever prolongs the word echad, proclaiming God's oneness in the Shema, so one's days and years are lengthened. It doesn't say that we add to his days and years. It says ma'arichin yamav u'shnotav, that the days get longer. What does it mean that the days get longer? But if you go through life with that profound sense of wonder to discover God's unity in every encounter, in every experience, discover the God speak in every encounter, like the Baal Shem Tov taught, that life, every experience in life is a lesson. And if you're able to hear those lessons, so then you're able to go through life as a child, not just driven with more energy, but also discover realms and realms of within reality that you don't pay attention to as an adult because of the complacency. So yes, spiritually, there's so much to learn from a child.
To add one little point to that, which is from a sort of sociological, cultural point of view, I think children used to be taken, children are meant to be seen, not heard. Even in traditions that take children seriously, it's because they see children as essentially future adults. And so children, the stage of childhood, is something we only take seriously in as much as that's part of an educational process that will eventually yield the future adults, who are seen to be the meaningful citizens or contributors or constituents of any said group or collective. And we, in fact, in the Jewish tradition, Shavuot, we just came from, have a midrash, which says that when God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, he asked for a guarantor. Initially, he said Moses, God rejects that. They say the elders, God rejects that, until they say our children will be our guarantors, right? That's one way of looking at it. But what we try to highlight in the book is actually a counterintuitive, but really and truly radical spiritual truth, which is that children are not just seen as potential adults or means to a greater end, as it were, as a form of the continuity of said tradition or civilization, but rather There was something uniquely precious about the state of childhood, which, by the way, is something we can all access even throughout adult life. And what is so unique about the state of childhood? There's something pristine, there's something pure, there's something unadulterated. I find it so interesting that in the English language, the way we refer to something as tainted is adulterated, including the word adult, as if somehow by becoming an adult, life becomes tainted. And it's true in a way. When we were children, things were black and white, and that's why children are, in a certain sense, more idealistic about things. If it's right, you got to do it. If it's wrong, not. That's, the Rebbe once explained why teens have such an angst-filled existence, because they're transitioning from that state where the world is black and white into a reality of gray. More nuanced, more pragmatic, but also therefore more compromised. And their angst is their expression and not understanding this new reality. How can we live in a world of compromise? And that's why young people very often want to shake away or shake off the established order or the shackles of conformity, etc. There's just one example I want to give you before I wrap this idea up. And that is that historically in the Jewish tradition, the Talmud teaches that at one point prophecy was removed. It was no longer the classic forms of the prophet communicating as the mouthpiece of God. But there is an exception. There are a few individuals or demographics that are seen to embody prophecy even post the prophetic era. One of those groups is children, which is why we find in the Purim story that when Mordechai learns of the decree against the Jewish people, essentially the final solution of his time, where does he go? He doesn't go to the elders. He doesn't convene an emergency session of the cabinet, of the Jewish leadership. He goes to a yard, a schoolyard, and he gathers some of the children and he says, Psok li psukecha, meaning, tell me what you studied today in school. Why did he do this? Because he saw them as a conduit of divine expression and communication. And when they told him they had learned those 3 verses we say each day in the prayers, Al tira, mipachad pitom, do not fear sudden terror, etc. An amazing declaration of faith. He was then calm and he knew things would work out well. What a profound insight. It's the adults who look to the children to understand the spiritual, ethereal, divine, and cosmic whispers of reality, which is why the Kabbalists would pray before beginning their prayers, Ani mitpalel ledat ze hatinok, which means if only I could pray with that sense of integrity of the child. In other words, these are the most spiritually sophisticated individuals. They knew the heavenly highways, as it were. They had the secret codes to the DNA of reality, and yet they asked God, please undo me my sophistication so that I might recapture the innocence, the majesty of childhood. Leda'at ze hatinok. What a powerful idea. And hence, it's not about growing out of childhood, but growing into childhood as we grow older.
So, Rabbi Kalmenson, let me take us from these absolute highest highs of spirituality, crashing right down back here to earth, because I'm reading this book and I'm feeling very, sort of transposed and elevated, and all of a sudden, what word jumps on the page, if not money? The most materialistic, you would think, earthly, lowly issue or concept. What's money doing in a book like this?
What's money got to do with it? Well, everything. There's a saying in the Talmud that says that our sages would treat their possessions even more with greater alacrity and conscientiousness than their life itself. This is based on the biblical account of Jacob, who we are told crossed back across the Jabbok River in order to retrieve small jars. Right? And by crossing back through that river at nighttime, he put his life in danger. So the Talmud says from this that our sages would treat the possessions with more preciousness and more care than even their life itself. Now, that seems to feed into some of those ancient anti-Semitic, unfortunately, modern day anti-Semitic tropes, doesn't it? But the truth is, if you replace the word money with instrument for positive impact and influence, everything makes sense. What do I mean by that? Judaism has a very different view on wealth and wealth generation than do other traditions, specifically religious, but also otherwise. Judaism sees wealth as a gift from God, handed to specific individuals who can handle the temptation and tests of wealth and utilize that wealth through this higher consciousness and perspective of changing this world, which in our paradigm can only be done through the medium of wealth, as it were. At least it's one of the tremendous currencies or tools that allow us to do that type of world change. And so that explains so many of the positive interpretations that Judaism has and attitudes towards wealth. And this is what we could explain is what the Talmud is saying, that our sages actually saw their health and well-being as a means to bettering the world through the gifts, the resources, the time, the energy, the network that God put into their orbit and into their life. And in that respect, the word kesef, which comes from the etymology of yearning for spiritual elevation, as it were, is so deeply synonymous with the perspective of wealth, because wealth truly can become an agent of spiritual dissemination and spiritual and moral and positive change.
I love this. Rabbi Abraham, anything to add?
To speak to the broader theme of the mundane and the spiritual and the fusion of the two, which is a central theme throughout the book again, we speak about in the entry about bread, lechem, it's from the word lochem, a warrior, where the real spiritual war, the battle, happens not when you're in the synagogue praying. It's afterwards. You go to the synagogue to ready yourself, to make sure that you're spiritually armed to be able to go out there in the world and fight the real fight. Because that battlefront is in business, it's when you sit down to eat, it's when you engage with the world. Another area that we found that, which is also fascinating, is in the word for synagogue. You know, their Reform calls many of their synagogues temples, but the term temple and synagogue are often used interchangeably. They mean something very different. A temple is really a sanctuary, a place of holiness. A synagogue is a Beit Knesset, a place of gathering. And what makes the synagogue holy is not the prayers that take place there necessarily, as much as it is the fact that people gather there. Right? There's no procedure for making a synagogue holy. It becomes holy because it becomes the place where people gather. So the olden day synagogues didn't actually have a separate social hall and sanctuary like today's synagogues do. It was one and the same thing, because the whole concept of the sanctuary was kind of to break that schism that exists between the spiritual and the mundane. That is the spiritual battle, to kind of reveal the spirituality, the holiness, the purpose that exists within everything.
Several of the, on the theme of gathering, several of the entries in the book are not only inspiring, but also genuinely thought-provoking in ways that have everything to do not just with the timeless questions of how to live a better, more spiritual life, but also the very timely questions of the here and now. And one of these entries that struck me in particular was the one about anti-Semitism, which you write, I think very profoundly, is not just the hatred of Jews, but also the hatred of Judaism and everything it represents. And here you write, somewhat provocatively in the book, assimilation is a big part of the problem. Explain this to me.
Since the book came out, the Austrian government came out with a study on anti-Semitism, and they found that one of the most effective solutions to anti-Semitism is actually to spread more awareness about Judaism, that people should become more familiar with what the Jewish message really is. The word anti-Semitism or sinah, hate, the Talmud connects with the word Sinai. That when we received the Torah at Sinai, that's when anti-Semitism began. Why is that? It's because we have a message to give to the world. And that message, there's a famous statement in the Talmud describing the interaction between Achashverosh and Haman, where Haman said to Achashverosh, destroy the Jews, here, take 10,000 talents of silver, it's all yours. And Achashverosh said, I don't need the money, go ahead, kill the Jews. And what's fascinating about that the Talmud gives an analogy of neighbors. One had a big pile of earth in his property, and another had a big ditch in his property. And they encountered each other one day, and they found out about each other's problem. This guy has a big ditch, this guy has a big mound. And the guy said, the person with the ditch said, I'll buy your earth from you to fill my ditch. But the other guy says, no, take it. It's free. What does the analogy mean? The Lubavitcher Rebbe points to a description of two types of anti-Semites. You have an anti-Semite who he feels this existential angst, something missing in himself. There's something that is missing in life. There's a sense of shallowness to life, that life doesn't have, it's missing meaning, purpose, it's missing something higher, it's missing something elevated. So they feel something's missing. And the Jew represents that. So they transpose their hatred they project their hatred on the Jew. And then you have the other type of anti-Semite who, well, the Jews are different. They stick out. They don't belong. They're in our way. That this big mound of earth that's on my property, how do I get rid of them? And both of them, the solution is really the same. It's about showing them our message so they don't see us as sticking out. They recognize the value in the message that we offer, and they recognize the value that it has for them. How we are there to be an Or LaGoyim, a light unto the nations, to bring a sense of godliness, a sense of higher purpose, a sense of life is worth more than, just going to work and making money and having a career and retiring. There's something more elevated about life that you can incorporate within your life. So there's a message that Jews need to get out there. And because that message, we're kind of like shy about the message, our response, a natural response to anti-Semitism is to, okay, let's not parade my Judaism out there. Let's hide anything that will identify me as a Jew, when the appropriate response would be, well, how do I educate my neighbor about what it means to be a Jew, about what the message of Judaism can mean for them? We bring a fascinating story, a parable that was said to describe the mystery of why Jews have existed for so long when all the other big civilizations came and faded. Rabbi Kook mentions. He says, like, you have the stage of life, you have the stage of civilization, and every nation comes and says its piece, it's finished speaking, and it goes off the stage. But the Jewish people are still there stuttering, trying to get our message out there. It's not quite gotten to the world, and therefore we're still over there doing the job that we're here to do. And that's the bottom line for about anti-Semitism, that this is not about the hatred. This is about creating that sense of understanding, an understanding of what it is that we're bringing to the world. And when we can step into the anti-Semitism, we can be proud about our Judaism in the face of that anti-Semitism. We can look the anti-Semite in the eye and say, look, I have a message for you. Right? That's the day that anti-Semitism will end.
Beautiful. Rabbi Kalmenson, anything to add?
There are many different forms and shades of anti-Semitism. And this has been one of those great questions that have troubled the thinkers for the longest time. But I think if you listen to one of the greatest anti-Semitism of history, you really get a very clear sense of everything we're talking about. And I guess one could, I'm not fond of quoting Hitler often, but I think on this note, you really do get a sense. And he said once, "Providence has ordained that I should be the greatest liberator of humanity. I'm freeing man from the restraints of an intelligence that has taken charge, from the dirty and degrading self-mortification of a false vision called conscience and morality, and from the demands of a freedom and independence that only a very few can bear." And that talks to what Reb Zalman said, which is that a Jew, whether they identify or not, whether they're engaged fully or not, embodies a certain principle, a certain, if you will, spiritual technology that we carry with us since Sinai. And hence, really, as Reb Zalman pointed out, the way to combat that is not to hide it, is not to deny it, but rather to find ways to really disseminate, to share that technology, and to allow the world at large to benefit from that value system that, to my mind, really forms the basis of the moral furniture of modern existence. And that, in my sense, talks to the fact that the world looks at Jewish people and says, well, you don't even inhabit your role and identity. You don't really stand for what you should be standing for. And then perhaps on a subconscious level, there was a certain lashing out. And so really the true way, to my mind, to overcome that is to create the bond, the bridge, the linkage between the rich tradition of old Sinai, bring it into the modern world, and in that way disseminate those teachings, but identify them as teachings of Judaism, and in that way create a much more resonant and inclusive and universal understanding of some of the teachings that really gave birth to Western civilization as we know it.
And the way to disseminate these teachings, of course, is, as we've been discussing here for a while now, through speech. So finally, before I say thank you to both of you, I would like to conclude, could it be any different, with the entry in the book for the word dibur, or speech itself. Leave us, please, with a meta understanding of the true power of dibur, of speech. Rabbi Kalmenson, I'll let you go first.
Thank you, Liel. And let me take the opportunity to thank you so much for hosting this conversation. So I think that it actually talks to a different question as well, which is, why is this book relevant today? What makes this book, out of many, uniquely relevant? And I think it's very connected to the idea that in reality, we live in a time where words have been terribly cheapened, where rhetoric is on the rise. And we see before our eyes how words literally shape society, either elevate, denigrate, build, destroy, unite, or divide. Unfortunately, words have been cheapened. They're used so callously. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we don't appreciate the power, the potency on a mystical, on a psychological, and on a sociological level of words, and their power to really not only express or communicate, but to shift, to shape, to mold, and to really create. And so one of the meditations or reflections I'd love to leave viewers with is the absolute centrality of our words to our own lives, to the lives of those around us, and to society at large. Because in fact, words are not just tools of communication, they're instruments for creation itself.
Rabbi Abraham?
50 years ago, if you were to want to become a Torah scholar and you didn't know how to read or understand Hebrew, you probably had very few books that were accessible to you. Maybe a Cincino Talmud with a very archaic translation, and a few other select books. There really was not very much for the English reader to be able to delve into. We've seen over the last 50 years an outpouring of translations. You can go on the internet and you can become a Torah scholar without even knowing how to read Hebrew. But there's an element that you don't get, that you miss when you learn from translation. Because there's a richness to the Hebrew language that is so deep that every time you encounter it, you can uncover new depths. Right? And our hope with this book is that people will just touch the surface in terms of realizing that there's so much deeper to go within the Hebrew language. The whole Hebrew word system is built on shorashim, on source letters. It's meant to take you from a concrete manifestation in an individual term back to the bigger idea, the broader idea, the deeper meaning that is within the word. And our hope is that people will be able to begin to access some of that depth that's hidden within Torah, and start taking the word seriously. I live in Brooklyn. And you walk down the street and you hear superlatives left, right, and center. Expletives more than superlatives. I feel it comes from the fact that people don't have the accurate words to express what they want to express. So they have to turn to all sorts of other ways of expressing it. And I'm guilty of this myself, of not really thinking about our words, counting our words, thinking carefully about the meaning of our words, because like we say in that entry on Dibur, that Dibur is really a davar. It's substantial. The words we say matter, right? And the words that we learn matter. And in a broader sense, everything around us, like I mentioned earlier, is God speak. It's communication. There's a message there. And the way to get the message is by better understanding the words. My grandfather, may he rest in peace, he taught me that whenever there's some kind of obscure understanding of something, you open a dictionary. Define the word. Today it's easier. You just click define and type the word into Google, and you get an accurate understanding of things. And I find myself doing this multiple times a day. I find it such a good way to kind of get closer and closer and closer to a deeper understanding, a more accurate understanding of the word, of yourself, of your reality, and ultimately of Torah. We're all meaning seekers, and the meanings are conveyed through words. That's the medium. So words are kind of like that packaging that you can unwrap layer by layer by layer to uncover deeper and deeper messages. And that's what this book is all about.
Rabbi Abraham, Rabbi Kalmenson, for this conversation and for giving us the book we need right now, filled with so much wisdom, so much insight, and so much inspiration for how to go ahead and live a better, more spiritually fulfilling life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liel.
Thank you so much, Liel. And Liel, if we may say, tremendous blessings to you in your work, in your endeavors, to take the power of letters and words and bring it to the wider world. You are a true role model and inspiration for so many of us who really attempt and endeavor every day to join you in your efforts to spread knowledge, to spread wisdom, and all in a manner that is so pertinent and sophisticated, but also very, very relevant to people's lives as they live them. So thank you, Liel.
Thank you, Rabbi. We all work full time for Hashem. Yay, that was great. Thank you.